All right, step 8. What did that look like? So step 8, what changed is we added a function called collapse up. Now we're not going to be able to test that unless we refresh the page. Perfect. Okay, so collapse up should make it so that when I press the up arrow, everything moves upward as much as it can. And if these two numbers had been the same, they should combine together and double. They're not the same, so what should happen is I should end up with a 4 here, a 2 here, and then the next tile gets added somewhere else on the grid. So let's test that. If I press up, looks like that's what happened. We got a 4 and then the 2 right where we expected, and then a random 2 appeared here. Okay, if we press up again, this should move up to there, and then we should get one more random tile appearing. And that happened, okay? And because all we have so far is the collapse up, we're not able to press down, left, or right. I mean, it doesn't do anything if I do. So only pressing upward does anything. So if I press up again, okay, now we're going to be able to test the doubling part because we have a 2 here and a 2 here. When I press up, this one is going to merge with that one, and that will become a 4. And then we'll get our other random tile appearing somewhere. So let's test that. I press up, and it worked. This turned into a 4, and then because that spot was vacant, that turned out to be the random position where the next tile spawned. So it looks like it works. So what's the code that made that happen? Well, the collapse up function is actually pretty complex. As you can see here, I wrote out lots of pseudocode in order to do this correctly. And if you'd like to dissect all of this and figure out exactly what's going on, I'm going to let you do that on your own time. But just trust that this is what this code does. So, step 9, let's see what step 9 is. If I hover over this, actually, it tells me what the name of this step is. Animate. Okay, so in this step, apparently when I move upward, now this will move and it'll actually show the movement. So let's test that. Perfect. Okay, so how did I make it do that? I set a timeout at the bottom right after the event that is going to redraw the grid after 150 milliseconds has passed. So the point of that is because each element now has an animation attribute, so it needs to show the animation and then as soon as the animation is done, redraw the grid in its current state, what it's supposed to be. So the animation attribute is entered right here. So it's a transition attribute, and I just used the code all 0.15 seconds. So any change we make to an element, whether that's a resizing change, a movement change, a rotation change, it's going to take 0.15 seconds for that change to occur. And that 0.15 seconds is, of course, the animation. So, and in order to make that work, we also had to give each element an attribute, and the attribute I'm using is just its location. It's I position, which is the row it's on. It's J position, which is the column it's on, separated by a space. Okay, so what that ID allows me to do is inside of the collapse function, we added some more code. We're just assuming that every single element on this grid is going to be animating. And obviously, if it's animating from this position to stay in this position, then the animation isn't going to actually happen, so that's fine. But we're just going to say, animate every single element, every single tile on here. And we're going to make each one animate by specifying inside of this function which thing is going to be animated, where it's going to start on the x-axis, where it's going to end on the x-axis, where it's going to start on the y-axis, and where it's going to end on the y-axis. So that function, animate div from point to point, looks like this. We've got the div, the left point, which is its original x, the final left, which is its final x, the current top, and then the final top, which is its y, how it changes on the y-axis, right? And I also created a function called draw empty tile. And the point of that is because when we move this black tile upward to animate it, something needs to immediately take its place. Something like a blank tile needs to appear there. Otherwise, it'll look like there's nothing there at all, right? So we want it to, like when I press up now, see how that white tile never changed? There was always a white tile underneath. That's because of the draw empty tile function. And then I made the tile that gets animated have an index, a z-index of 2. A z-index is how you define the layer of an element, whether it's on top of something or underneath something. So we wanted it to be on top of anything so that it doesn't move underneath the blank tiles. So giving it the value 2 made it higher than anything else. And then for some reason I just told it to wait 10 milliseconds before it actually changes these attributes to be the final value. I can't remember what happens if you don't wait 10 seconds. Maybe you could try that out if you'd like. So what actually allowed us to change each div, each element, each tile, is the ID. See, right before I call that function, I use its ID, get element by ID, with the row and the column and a space in between. That's how I grabbed each individual div and then passed it to that function to be animated. And I also, you might have noticed, I added some things in here. The final top variable gets initialized based on its current position, or where it's supposed to end up, actually. And then also the current top is based on its current position. So going upward, all we're changing is the y value, right? So we don't have any changing of the left attribute. So there's no cur left, there's no final left. But in a later operation, when we're collapsing to the right or the left, then we will have to change those things. Okay. All right. So what's next? Step 10. If we hover over this, says check if the tile moved. So this is important. I guess I should have showed you on the last one. So the way the game works is if I press up but nothing actually moves, it shouldn't make another tile spawn here yet. So watch this. If I press up, it spawned a new tile anyway. And that's because we didn't make a check for that yet. So that's what step 10 is. Step 10 says make sure that something moves before you spawn a new tile. And the code that did that is right here. We have a variable being returned, and it's a true or false variable, and it's called tiles have moved. It gets created right here and given the initial value false. So we're just going to assume that nothing moved unless that happens to get changed somewhere. And the only way that it gets changed is if the current position and the final position are different, because that means it's obviously changing its position. So right here is where I check. I check if the current top value, which is its y position of the thing being moved, is not equal to the final top value, is where it's supposed to end up, then we know that at least one thing has moved, because this is going to happen for every single tile. Remember, this is inside of the grid, all the rows, all the columns. Each tile gets moved, quote unquote moved. We don't know if it actually moves. Obviously, if the current value and its final value end up being the same, then it's not actually moving. But we know that if they're different, it did move. Therefore, we say tiles have moved now equals true. And that's okay, even if just one tile moves, then this gets set to true, and that returns the true value. Okay, so collapse up now returns a true value. What that means is inside of our onKeyDown function, it now says if collapse up, then add tile. So it's still running the collapse up function, but it's using the return value from that function to decide whether or not to actually add another tile. Okay, because this is either a true or a false. If it's a false, it doesn't add another tile. So let's test it out. Right here, it should move, so it should add another tile. I move up, it added a 2. Okay, if I press up again, it should move and add another tile. Good. But this time, when I press up, nothing's going to move. So let's see if it actually adds another tile. I press up, I'm pressing up lots of times, nothing happens. So that's good. It appears that that code works. Oh, on a previous step, I forgot to point out that we're initializing the grid model now before we draw the grid.